Last week, a white supremacist killed a black student on a historically black university campus in Baltimore. Last month, Ebony Zamani Gallagher, a black woman full professor and one of our nation's leading researchers on community colleges at the University of Illinois, was called a nigger as she walked on the campus of another Big Ten university where she was attending a meeting. Last semester, a dark-skinned Muslim woman was attacked in a parking garage at San Jose State University. Her attacker pulled her to the ground by her hijab. That was one day after the election of Donald Trump. 2 days later, at the University of Pennsylvania, where I work, every black freshman student received a series of racist emails through GroupMe. Now, these emails were not just racially offensive, they were also scary, as they included threats of lynching of black people. 3 days after the election of Donald Trump. On campus after campus across the country, we hear these horrifying incidents of racial violence against students of color. Latino students are constantly called illegals. Asian American students are constantly called chinks and other racially offensive and derogatory terms. Racial epithets are spray painted on students' residence hall doors and on ethnic cultural centers. Blackface parties continue to be in vogue on many predominantly white campuses. We also hear from students of color that their white professors are absolutely shocked when they write well and therefore accuse them of plagiarism. Meanwhile, you all are leaders. You receive reports from your offices of institutional research that show durable and troubling racial disparities between students, faculty, and staff members of color and their white counterparts on a range of metrics and outcomes. These are all reminders that race still matters in college. Students of color across the country for the past 18 months have also been reminding us that race still matters in college through their activism and their protest. To be sure, University of Missouri students were protesting the administration's lack of responsiveness to the persistent reports of racism that they were trying to get their leaders to hear and more deeply understand. Those students were trying to help us understand that race still matters in college. The press attempts to help us understand that race still matters in college. By week after week after week in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in the New York Times, in Inside Higher Ed and elsewhere, there are these horrifying stories of racial incidents that are happening all across our country. Now, despite this evidence in reporting, despite the evidence in research from the narratives and experiences of people of color on predominantly white campuses, I'm afraid that many leaders are disillusioned about the realities of race. In Inside Higher Ed's annual survey of college presidents, 83% of respondents agreed that race is still a major issue on campuses across the country. 83% agreed. But yet 23% of those same respondents said, oh, race is not a major issue on my campus, which seems to signal a major disconnect. In my 19-year career in higher education, first as an administrator and now as a faculty member, my goal has been to create inclusive and equitable classrooms, campuses, and other spaces on college and university campuses. For the past 6 years at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education, we have been at the forefront of these issues. Now, we've done this in a number of ways that I will quickly tell you about. The first is through advising dozens of boards of trustees, presidents and their cabinets, and other senior higher education leaders on strategic equity planning, on crisis management, and on messaging both personal and institutional commitments to equity. We've also advanced racial equity by convening more than 30,000 higher education leaders through our Penn Summit series on the University of Pennsylvania campus for 1 to 4 day conferences, workshops, and teach-ins in which we've equipped higher education leaders with equity, not just recognize inequities, but how to do racial equity as leaders. We certainly have published a multitude of research reports that always include several concrete recommendations for higher education policy and practice that have been enormously useful to higher ed leaders. And perhaps the thing for which we're best known are the qualitative campus climate studies that we've now done. Center researchers and I have conducted interviews with more than 10,000 students, faculty, and staff members across all racial groups, including whites, all across the country. We often say of our qualitative campus climate studies that they've literally taken us from Portland Community College to Princeton University and several dozen places in between in terms of institutional type, size, and geography. Our goal at the Penn Center has always been to be helpful to higher education institutions, not just to criticize their lack of racial responsiveness and racial inclusiveness, but we want to be helpful to leaders. That will continue to be our goal as we transition to the University of Southern California on July 1st. There, we will launch the USC Race and Equity Center, which will be an interdisciplinary research center that brings together several dozen racial equity experts from the Rasier School of Education and USC's 18 other academic schools. We want to be helpful to the nation on a range of vexing racial equity issues and opportunities, including those that persistently plague colleges and universities. So in our remaining time, I want to talk with you about just a handful of opportunities that I think are useful for higher ed leaders to think about, and I certainly will tell you how we plan to think about and be helpful to institutions through our center at USC. The first opportunity is to improve racial climates. I opened by talking with you about only a handful of examples of vexing racial problems on college campuses. Through our campus racial climate research studies, we've heard hundreds of other stories that we literally could spend the next day and a half, me just telling you one after the other about those stories. I won't do that in the interest of time. But I do think that there's a real opportunity here for institutional leaders to actually improve campus climates. You can do that by convening listening sessions in which you, as the dean, or as the provost, or as the college president, actually sit with people of color and listen to them talk about their racialized experiences on the campus. And where you sit and you listen to white students talk about their feelings of underpreparedness for citizenship in a racially diverse democracy. And you sit and you listen to members of your community as they try to help you make sense of observable patterns of racial segregation on our campuses. Leaders also have to be willing to not only listen, but act. Act by convening working groups like they've done at Emory University in such an impressive fashion. Working groups that are comprised of students, faculty, and administrators and alumni across all racial groups, including white people, not just the chief diversity officer, not just the handful of people of color that you have on your campus, but also including white people, to work in strategic and collaborative ways to advance racial equity and to help the institution more fully realize its commitments to inclusion and diversity. One other thing that you can do as leaders is demand the ongoing rigorous and systematic collection of campus climate data, so that you're not one of these disillusioned survey respondents who thinks that race isn't a problem on your campus, but instead you are responding with evidence that has been systematically collected about the campus racial climate, and not just collecting the data, but actually doing something with it. At the USC Race and Equity Center, we will soon be launching the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates, which will be an annual quantitative survey that allows us to survey thousands, perhaps millions of college students on hundreds of campuses across the country. And it will allow institutions that participate to benchmark against peer institutions and institutions of similar size, type, geography, and mission. The next opportunity is to diversify the post-secondary workforce. I often hear from college leaders that, oh, we can't find any highly qualified people of color for professorships or for senior administrative roles. Meanwhile, I find myself at convenings every year, literally with hundreds of people of color, mostly with Ph.D.s, who want to be professors, who want to be senior administrators, but yet can't seem to be given the opportunity to do so. It is important for senior leaders to first start with yourselves. If you're going to be the person who is messaging the importance of having a diverse workforce, it's probably a good idea for your senior leadership team to represent that diversity for which you're calling at your institution. As senior leaders, you also have to push the people who are your direct reports by sending back searches that lack racial diversity, and be unwilling to accept the excuse that we cannot find highly qualified people of color anywhere who are willing to be in these roles. We will be helpful to you by launching what we're calling the National Registry of Employable People of Color, professionals of color in higher education, which will be a searchable database, both for faculty members, searchable by discipline and rank, as well as by senior administrative roles. And that will be launched at the center next year. The last opportunity here in my remaining minute and a half is to develop what we call racial literacy. You cannot lead on racial equity if you don't know how to talk about race. You probably didn't learn how to do that in college president school or provost school or dean school, because there is no such place. So we hear from leaders all across the country year after year that we're so committed to these things, but honestly, we just don't know how to do them. So through our USC Race and Equity Institutes, we literally teach higher ed leaders how to do racial equity. We do this through a series that occurs over a 4-week period in which we bring together 20 leaders on a single campus. So imagine the provost, all the vice provosts, and all the academic deans are engaged twice a week over a 4-week period in a series of modules synchronously, and we deliver the instruction from USC, and we teach them things that they never learned anywhere else that are requisite skills for doing racial equity. Just to give you some sense of the modules that we're offering through these USC Equity Institutes, like we literally teach people, how do you talk about race without it getting explosive and getting out of hand? How do you as a white person lead a conversation about race in a way where you're not tripping over yourself and embarrassing yourself? How do you make curricula inclusive and culturally responsive? How do you address racial tensions when they arise on your cabinet and elsewhere at the institution? And how do you message, as the leader, your individual commitment as well as institutional commitment to racial equity? So I will conclude by saying that, as has been the case at the Penn Center, it will continue to be the case as we move west and work on our tans and hang out with movie stars, that we also firmly commit ourselves to being very helpful to higher education leaders as you attempt to achieve and advance racial equity. Thank you.